Hi and welcome to Classic MGB and another Viewers Cars episode. For this one, we're off to sunny California to meet Chris Hayes on a superb MGB Roadster. Chris was born and brought up in the UK and helped his father rebuild an MGB before moving to the United States, so he knew a fair bit about restoring MGBs. But it wasn't until he got his chosen car home that he realised it would be a lot more work than he first thought. This one's a bit of a marathon, so grab a cup of tea and sit back and enjoy how Chris transformed a vehicle that many said was fit for the scrapyard into one of the best MGBs we've ever come across. The story begins in 2009 and Chris was pondering rebuilding a 1970 MGB similar to the one his father had built back in the UK. He also hoped that this would allow him to pass on some of the skills to his children. Chris began by thoroughly researching the market, what to look for, what to avoid, and some idea of just how much time and money would be needed. Online seemed the ideal starting point, and as the MGB is very popular, nearly 90% of Roadsters were exported, and most of those went to the US. There were plenty to choose from. As with many classic cars, the prices and condition of the cars available varied hugely, so Chris decided to focus on cars in California to allow him to inspect any prospective purchase before laying out the cash. Of course, with many people, me included, the heart sometimes ruled the head, so when he saw the seemingly perfect car on eBay for just $500, he contacted the seller, who was based in Sacramento. After a chat, Chris found out that the owner has a restored MGB as his daily driver and seemed to know what he was talking about. So he placed a bid and eventually won the car for just $600. Chris trailered the car home and at first glance it looked reasonable, although at that price his expectations weren't that high. First of all the fluids were replaced and a new battery was added, and the inspection began in earnest. To his surprise, the car started and ran pretty well, so things were looking up, and even after jacking it up and crawling around underneath, rust was clearly apparent, but nothing seemed serious, although the factory underseal covered the majority of the underside. Chris decided that he would do 100% restoration and take it completely apart. The body came first, and remembering the struggle of trying to weld upside down, he decided to build a rotisserie to make the work easier. This turned out to be a very good decision, as we'll find out later. Once the years of muck, underseal paint, sound insulation and carpet had been removed, more of the horror became visible. It was clear that many previous owners had attempted repairs, but none were successful, and may well have made things worse. Chris originally thought he'd bought a California car, but it transpired that the car had originally come from New York. Worryingly, the outer and inner sills had been replaced, but they were not properly welded on, just tacked in a few places by brazing. Once these were removed, the rust was everywhere. The inner membrane panel was so rusted, very little of it was left. The castle rails and other structural pieces were in terrible shape. With all this corrosion, it's probably a miracle that the car didn't fold in two when driven. Chris planned on getting the body media blasted, but felt it would be too risky to move the car before the main structural pieces were fixed. One of the big advantages of MGBs is the availability of spares, so after a phone call with Moss, all the required panels were ordered. Clearly, having the car on the rotisserie made it so much easier to work on, although cutting the rust away to allow the new panels to be welded to clean metal proved challenging. After all the serious panel replacements were completed, which ended up taking several years due to work pressures and life getting in the way, the car went to Anacapa blasting for a media blast and a light coat of epoxy primer to prevent further rust. This unearthed a whole new set of rust holes to repair, including new front fenders or bumpers for the UK audience. Chris had decided to have an MGB engine built with a supercharger using the Moss kit. Through the MG Experience, which is a mine of information, Chris made contact with Dave Headley, an engine engineer with General Motors who had retired and was building MGB engines, mostly for racing. He raced an MGB for over 30 years, but since he retired from that, he specialised in building engines for others. Chris then popped the engine and supercharger kit into his truck and set off to Dave's workshop in Colorado. All the machine work was done to Dave's specifications and was assembled with forged pistons, APT cam and aluminium flywheel. The head was 80% polished, which apparently is all that's needed if you're not going racing at very high revs. Suspension was next, and as Chris was visiting England, he decided to visit well-known MGB specialists Frontline Developments. After some thought and considerable expense, a complete 5-link rear suspension, upgraded front suspension, adjustable coilovers all around, 4-piston brakes and a Vitesse 5-speed Mazda-based gearbox was purchased and shipped to California. The dash of the 1970 MGB was a victim of the US crash regulations, so it featured the so-called pillow dash, had square switches and no glove box. Now, whilst these might appeal to some, Chris didn't like it, so he found a dash from a 1963 MGB with all the classic gauges and toggle switches. Sadly, this seemingly simple swap wasn't as straightforward as expected, as the inner structure was different. So, a trip to a scrapyard for old English cars in Lake Elsinore that contained over 200 MGBs, as well as some Triumphs and Rovers, resulted in an appropriate panel, which was grafted into the car to allow the 1963 dash to fit. But that wasn't all. The steering column had to be changed, and that meant different light and wiper stalks, as well as a custom shroud. Overall, this process, which at first glance should have been simple, ended up taking a lot of time and a certain amount of trial and error. Where have I heard that before when it comes to MGBs? Chris had planned to do all the bodywork and paint himself, so built a spray booth in his garage. This included all the extraction fans, fine filters and protective gear. However, once he'd primed the car and added back the underseal coatings in the booth, he realised that although it had been well sealed, some of the primer had found its way out. This really wasn't a problem as his garage floor was grey anyway, but he decided that the bright red colour he'd chosen for the car wouldn't enhance his garage. As a result, Chris took the shell, still on its rotisserie, to Dave Wellwood's shop to do the final paint. They decided to paint all the interior, engine bay, boot and underside first, then do the exterior after assembly. The rear axle and front suspension were refurbished and all the plumbing for brakes, fuel lines and major electrical lines was completed, whilst the car was upside down on the rotisserie. This was clearly much easier than laying underneath the car. After the car was put on its wheels, the engine, gearbox and associated fittings were installed. Chris's eldest son, also called Chris, had worked with a chap called Ken Whitney in Newbury Park, who was an expert in car wiring. He worked for hot rod pioneer Boyd Coddington and his TV show American Hot Rod. Chris Jr. learned a lot from Ken and the many experiences doing custom wire projects, so he was the obvious choice to help with the MGB. They started with a Moss original wire harness, but soon abandoned it as there were so many changes to be made, adding relays, etc. They then chose a custom kit from Advance Auto Wire that included all the relays and a modern fuse panel. Sensibly, all the wires were up-gauged to carry more current and colour-coded the same as a 1970 MGB Roadster. That way, future troubleshooting would be much easier. All the wires are, to the maximum extent possible, hidden, so it cleaned the engine bay up considerably. Once the wiring was complete, it was time to start the engine for the first time, probably the most anticipated moment of any project. Happily, the engine fired right up, as was expected, as it had been run on an engine stand at the engine builder before it was shipped to Chris. To help finish the car, Chris contacted Steve Friedman, who was going to finish the exterior. Steve being as busy as he always is, it was hard to get a start date, so Chris asked him if he could work with him doing the final bodywork. He agreed, so they spent some outstanding weeks working together, with Chris painting some of the early coats in the booth with him. Through this process, Chris got his car prepped and expertly painted, learnt a lot and gained a treasured friend. Steve recommended an upholstery shop not far from his shop, so Chris drew up what the interior should look like based on inspiration from his visit to Frontline Developments, as he loved their interiors. He decided that everything in the interior should be leather. It's hard to believe there are 6 full hides of leather in his MGB. The work was carried out by Manuel and his team at Quality Upholstery in Ventura, and they did a first-class job. All that remained was all the final polishing and trim pieces, bumpers, lights, etc. There were plenty of much smaller decisions and actions that took place over the 10 years the project took. This did include plenty of downtime, as work or family always took priority, although retirement clearly helped get the project over the finishing line. So at the end of the 10-year journey, Chris said he was glad that he'd restored the car and hoped that his dad was looking down on him approvingly, and that whilst he has a car he really enjoys, he did say he wouldn't undertake such a massive project again. Clearly a project of this length needed family support, and Chris says that regular supplies of tea and biscuits from his wife Ingrid helped immensely when he was getting frustrated with the English engineers who designed the car. Finally, Chris says the most important part was spending time with his 3 children who helped with the whole project, so it sounds like the car will be in the family for a long time to come. So that's it, one of the nicest MGBs we've seen and a lovely story to go with it. If you fancy your car being the star in a future episode, then drop us an email at hello@classicmgb.com with some details about the car, together with plenty of good quality images and some video if possible. If they're too big, just send them via WeTransfer. As always, many thanks for watching and take care.